Lee Kuan Yew and Deconstructing Singapore's Impossible. Imagine this scenario. You are handed a tiny slice of land, barely 700 square kilometers of sand dumped into the edge of the Pacific Ocean, with not a single drop of oil, no gold mines, and not even enough fresh water to keep your people from dying of thirst. You are surrounded by hostile neighbors. Your city is torn apart by violent ethnic riots between Chinese, Malay, and Indian factions, and on top of all that, your surrounding rivals are happily predicting that your statehood will collapse within weeks. If you think the solution to this nightmare is searching for a magical formula or waiting for a stroke of miraculous luck to fall from the sky, you need to re-examine how you understand the world. History does not acknowledge coincidences, and monumental success is never a stroke of fate. It is the result of a cold, rational equation where data is gathered, logical fallacies are stripped away, and variables are decisively manipulated. On August 9, 1965, Singapore did not light up fireworks to celebrate its independence. It was forcibly expelled from the Federation of Malaysia and left weeping on the sidewalk. But the man who cried on live television that day, Lee Kuan Yew, did not retreat into emotional despair. He took these malaria-infested swamps and suffocating heat and built one of the wealthiest, safest, and most rationally engineered places on planet Earth. How did a bankrupt swamp transform into a global financial hub operating with Swiss precision? Stop betting on luck and let us analyze how survival is engineered through pure logic. Chapter 1. Dissecting the Catastrophe and the August 9th Mandate. To analyze any phenomenon, we must dissect its context with scientific rigor, free from romantic storytelling. On August 9, 1965, Singapore's separation from the Malaysian Federation was officially announced. This independence was not the triumphant outcome of a heroic liberation war, but a forced expulsion enacted by the central government in Kuala Lumpur under Prime Minister Tun Abdul Rahman after a brief failed merger that had begun on September 16, 1963. The baseline data for Singapore on that day was a complete catastrophe. We're talking about an island covering a mere 581 square kilometers with a population of 1.9 million people completely devoid of natural assets. Infrastructure was dilapidated, unemployment exceeded 12%, and the vast majority of citizens lived in unsanitary slums plagued by disease and crime. Prior to this moment, the territory had been battered by consecutive crises: a brutal Japanese occupation between 1942 and 1945 that shattered its social fabric, and a hasty British colonial retreat that left behind a fragile local administration, followed by deadly racial riots in 1964 between Malays and Chinese that turned the streets into battlegrounds. To make matters worse, the British government announced in 1968 its intention to completely withdraw all military forces east of Suez, a withdrawal completed by 1971. That single decision meant Singapore instantly lost over 20% of its gross domestic product and tens of thousands of direct and indirect jobs supported by British bases. Faced with this collapse, the leadership could have succumbed to despair or begged for permanent foreign aid. This is precisely where critical scientific thinking diverges from emotional reactivity. Raw data was collected without distortion. A tiny island, no military defense, zero resources, no domestic market to absorb industrial output, and a population fractured by language and ethnicity. Empirical deduction yielded a single cold truth. If Singapore continued to use traditional post-colonial strategies, systemic death was inevitable. Falling into the sunk cost fallacy by mourning the failed merger with Malaysia or begging to be taken back would have drained their remaining reserves. The first logical decision was to close the book on the past entirely, treating the present as a clean slate for an unconventional survival strategy. Chapter 2. Deconstructing Illusion and Prevailing Political Fallacies. When building a nation or an enterprise from scratch, your primary enemy is not a lack of capital, but the flawed intuition and logical fallacies governing the minds around you. In the 1960s, most emerging third-world nations fell into the grand ideological rhetoric. They routinely fell victim to the appeal to tradition, clinging to tribal or feudal governance models, or succumbed to the appeal to authority, blindly accepting dogma prescribed by Western academic elites or the fashionable socialist doctrines of the era. Lee Kuan Yew and his ruling People's Action Party exercised brutal critical thinking against these fallacies. They refused to get trapped in the false dilemma, which forced developing nations to choose between Western neocolonialism or radical communist alignments. Instead, they engineered a pragmatic third option. Singapore would align with no single superpower, but would transform itself into an indispensable high-efficiency service node for global capital. While neighboring states were expelling foreign corporations under the banner of anti-imperialism, Lee Kuan Yew and his chief economic architect, Goh Keng Swee, were traveling the globe to woo multinationals. Their underlying logic was straightforward. If Western and Japanese multinationals possessed technology, capital, and global distribution networks, while Singapore possessed cheap labor and a strategic maritime location, rejecting them was pure foolishness. They shattered the hasty generalization that equated all foreign investment with colonial exploitation. Instead, by gathering precise data on global corporate operations, they crafted policies making Singapore the most secure, profitable, and frictionless environment in Asia for international enterprise. They understood that ideology does not feed a hungry population, and passionate speeches do not build schools. They replaced slogans with cold calculus.
Chapter 3. Engineering Variables, From Corruption to Housing. A sound logical decision does not remain a theoretical concept. It manifests in reality by altering specific input variables to produce concrete outcomes. The Singaporean leadership took their initial baseline data and systematically modified 4 core variables to pull the state back from the brink. The first variable was administrative corruption. Corruption in any state is not merely a moral failure, it is an added operational cost that destroys economic efficiency. To address this, the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau was given extraordinary mandate, showing zero leniency even to senior cabinet ministers. However, the most brilliant aspect of their scientific approach was not merely punishment, but restructuring human incentives. The salaries of government ministers and top private sector executives were raised to match top-tier private sector executive pay. The equation was simple. If a public official is compensated at market rates, guaranteeing a prosperous life, the risk cost of losing their career and facing imprisonment for accepting a bribe vastly outweighs any illicit gain. The second variable was language and ethnic identity. In a society comprised of a Chinese majority alongside Malay and Indian minorities, designating Chinese as the national language would have triggered civil war and entrenched ethnic dominance. Conversely, adopting Malay as the sole language would have severed the country from global trade. The variable altered was establishing English as the neutral working language for government, business, and education, while mandating native mother tongues as a secondary language to preserve cultural identity. This unemotional decision achieved 2 critical outcomes. It unified all ethnic groups under a neutral framework that granted no single group an advantage, and it instantly wired the workforce into the global economy. The third variable was housing and social integration. The government established the Housing and Development Board to construct high-density public housing. The goal was not simply shelter, but social engineering through the mandatory ethnic integration policy. No public housing block was permitted to exceed strict racial quotas. Ethnic groups were intentionally integrated in daily life, sharing elevators, playgrounds, and food centers. This variable dismantled ethnic ghettos, turning strangers into daily neighbors and drastically reduced racial friction. The fourth variable was converting personal savings into national capital. The government instituted the Central Provident Fund, a mandatory Social Security savings scheme funded by employee and employer contributions. These funds were not absorbed as general tax revenue, but held in individual accounts used to purchase public housing, fund healthcare, and secure retirement. Through this mechanism, citizens transformed from passive welfare recipients to equity holders with a direct financial stake in the stability and survival of the state. Chapter 4: The Equation of Survival and Minimizing Mass Pain. When we filter these actions through our primary decision criteria, prioritizing systemic survival and the reduction of collective pain over immediate individual happiness, we uncover the underlying logic behind Singapore's famous authoritarian precision. Lee Kuan Yew placed absolute priority on survival. Singapore did not have the luxury of political chaos or ideological drift. When Britain withdrew its forces, Singapore could not wait for external protectors. Mandatory national service was established for all young males, and Israel was quietly brought in to advise on building a high-readiness modern defense force, operating discreetly to avoid provoking surrounding Muslim-majority neighbors. Building a credible military deterrent was a non-negotiable prerequisite. Without sovereign defense, economic growth was merely a temporary asset waiting to be seized. When managing water resources, Singapore historically relied on imports from Malaysia via the Johor agreements. Malaysian politicians regularly used the threat of shutting off the water supply as diplomatic leverage. This existential vulnerability presented a constant source of systemic risk. Rather than resorting to empty military posture, the leadership used scientific innovation to alter the variable. The state invested heavily in desalination plants, rainwater catchment reservoirs, and advanced water reclamation technology, creating new water. This high-tech recycled water surpassed standard WHO drinking water benchmarks. What was once an existential weakness became complete water self-sufficiency by the 21st century. Similarly, Singapore's notoriously strict legal framework, including heavy fines, public caning, bans on chewing gum, and mandatory capital punishment for drug trafficking, must be evaluated through the lens of minimizing collective harm. The individual liberties of drug traffickers or vandals were sacrificed to mitigate the far greater pain of societal decay, organized crime, and public health crises. The underlying math dictated that the systemic pain of lawlessness was infinitely worse than the pain of enforcing strict civic discipline. Singapore prioritized safety and absolute public order over unchecked individual license, recognizing that security was the primary prerequisite for attracting international capital. Conclusion: narrative rationality in building civilizations. Ultimately, Singapore's transformation was not a magic trick, nor was it a historical accident, and it certainly was not an unexplainable miracle. Labeling it a miracle is intellectual laziness used by those who refuse to analyze cause and effect. What occurred on this small island was applied science, a cold, unromantic application of logical thinking to human societies. Lee Kuan Yew and his team demonstrated that natural resources, vast geography, and deep history are not the sole determinants of national success. The most valuable asset is a disciplined human mind capable of gathering empirical data without delusion and executing decisions free from ideological fallacies. When your primary metric is preserving the survival of the entity and systematically minimizing collective pain, success ceases to be a poetic ideal and becomes the only remaining mathematical outcome. They took a bankrupt swamp and drained it. They took poverty and dismantled it. They took a fractured demographic and forged a unified society. They achieved this not through grand speeches, but through relentless calculation, data gathering, and decisive execution. Singapore's story stands as a clear blueprint for real-world problem-solving. When faced with overwhelming crisis, do not pray for a miracle. Gather your data, eliminate your fallacies, alter your variables, and let code logic dictate the path to victory. What did you gain from the video?